Welcome to Happy Writing, your podcast home for taking positive steps forward with your author business. I'm your host and happy writer-in-chief, Dion Abulela. For joining us today, you can get the first 3 months of membership to the Happy Writing Author Lounge for only $5 a month. Simply use the code HAPPYPODCAST and join us over in the Author Lounge. Today's podcast episode is sponsored by Dorianne Dupre, author of the award-winning novel Scout's Honor. Scout's Honor shows you how far one person will go to save their honor and who really has a hold of it in the first place. You can find Scout's Honor at your favorite booksellers such as Amazon, Kobo, Barnes & Noble, and more. Welcome to the Happy Writing Podcast. This is your host, Dion Abulela, and I am joined today by Sophie Bennett. Sophie is a keynote speaker, and she has a new book called Fired Up that will be releasing shortly. And Sophie specializes in helping people find their purpose, understanding their motivation, and looking at strategies for their success. So welcome to Happy Writing, Sophie.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a delight to be here.
Well, we are so excited to talk to you. Do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what it is that you do?
Yeah, so I'm a corporate keynote speaker, and I go in speaking to organizations about how they develop leadership strategies and how they improve their personal communication, and really to make sure that people are looking in the right direction to make the most of their talents. And that's really what the next book is all about. So I write a lot. I write for other people as well.
Oh, that's so exciting. Tell us a little bit about your writing process then, not just for Fired Up, but for all of the writing that you do.
Okay, well, I do come at things from a similar approach, although it is quite an organic process. I think that's half the fun of it. I'm a trained author, and I say that in a sense that I came from a business background. So my first interest in writing was as a kid. I used to love writing stories. And my dad was a journalist, so he taught me to type when I was about 8 years old. I'm old enough that it was a manual typewriter. So I remember sitting there with a dishcloth on my hands, a plan of where the letters were next to me on one side and a plan of where the keys were on another. And that's how I learned to touch type. So that was a long time ago. And I remember writing stories with my dad. So I had some creative writing training just because Dad was a journalist, and that's what we did. He taught me to write headlines. I never imagined that 30 years later that I'd be writing a best-selling book and helping others with theirs. So just never know where experience comes in useful. So that was how I started. Much later, I had a 20-year gap where I did a little bit of journalism for some specialist interest magazines, but I was a professional sportswoman for nearly 20 years. So I took some time off writing. I wasn't at the keyboard. I was on a horse instead, or I was on skis. And I just stepped away from writing completely during that time. When I came back to it and I got injured from sport, I came in from a completely different angle, and I got trained to use a scientific writing methodology. And back in the late 90s, I was using that information science to design intranets because I had a very strong understanding that I'd been given through the skills training about how people navigated information, how they attained information, and how language opened doors in the mind. So it was all in the context of selling and marketing. So I write for companies like Dell and Shell Oil and BP and things like that. So I was writing persuasive documentation for them. So I started to get a very good understanding of what switches people's mind. And then as soon as I got the chance, I was able to start writing books. And so it's been quite a long journey to get to the book writing. So it's a combination of that sort of creative side of myself and a very scientific way of approaching how to chunk your thoughts, how to organize your thinking, and then use that as a framework for being creative on top of it. Because doing it that way around, you don't get thought spaghetti. I'm sure you know what that feels like. Sure, every writer out there knows
Absolutely.
to have thought spaghetti.
I'm so mesmerized now by the thought of approaching your writing from a scientific perspective. Is it kind of like placing it? Can you explain that a little bit more for us?
Yeah,
Because I'm sure
absolutely.
not the only
Definitely.
person
So the human brain, we process information in different styles depending on who we are. So if we're very detail focused, we'll want to read every single word to be able to get our comprehension as we go along. And that's about 50% of the population. But you have another 50%, the other half of the population, use our brains differently. And we are skip and scan readers. So they are readers that are looking for keywords, looking for headlines. So for those types of readers, they need to see the whole structure of the content before they start in order to make sense of it as they go along. So some people comprehend information step by step and build a picture, and others have to see the whole picture and fill in the gaps. So when you understand that, you start looking at writing in a very different way, because otherwise your writing style has the danger of only appealing to half the population. Now, not everybody's going to like everybody's writing style anyway, so always write for the people that you know are going to love what you do. However, having that knowledge helps you write and structure your work in a way that is going to get most wide appeal from your audience. It's going to alienate the fewest people. So I usually start from a structural point of view, and I want to know what the big idea is. So I really get clear about the purpose of what I'm writing. This is particularly the case for non-fiction. It's slightly different for fiction, but there's still the framework needs to be there. So I look for the big idea and I express that in as many ways as I can. So I might brainstorm it on 3 or 4 bits of paper and just write all the key parts of the idea out to just fully form the picture. So for example, on the latest book, which is all about motivation and what really fires us up, what was the purpose of that? So before I started writing, I was very clear what I wanted to do. I wanted to explore what was different about driven people to people who aren't driven, who struggle to find motivation. So I had that picture very, very clear in my head. Then after that, once I know what the big picture is, and I do this if I coach writers as well, is then I say, okay, if you were teaching me all your knowledge, what would be the 5 to 7 things that I would have to know in order to be as good as you are to develop your level of skill or your level of knowledge? And people find that a really easy question to answer. So generally people say, oh, well, you'd need great people skills. You need to know this technical skill. You need to get involved in these networks, and you need these qualifications, or whatever it is. So people know what those 5 to 7 things are. So they're your chapter headings, or they're your section headings. Now, obviously, they're not book ready, because usually the dry knowledge is not the same as something that entices a reader. So the language is going to change, but the core ideas won't. And then you take one of those things and say, okay, if you need these better people skills to be able to deliver on this, or be good at this thing, what are the 3 to 5 key people skills that you need? And that people find that easy too. They say, okay, you need to be able to, let's say, influence people. You need to be able to motivate people, and so on. So within usually an hour, you can get a very clear overview about what needs to go into the content. So I tend to do that first, and that can take, depending on the complexity of the book, because I ghostwrite as well, it can take an hour or it can take a week. So I did one last year, for example, that was about robotics and artificial intelligence, and I don't know anything about artificial intelligence and machine learning and robots and algorithms. It's not my subject. So I didn't know what was important to know about. But I was able to extract that from the person that was paying me to write the book. So that was easy to extract. It took a couple of days. And then we went and filled in the technical gaps using that same strategy that I've just described to you. So we had the chapter headers. And then after that, that big map of the book. It can be as a mind map. Some people like it as a series of post-it notes. Some people like lists. It a little bit depends on your visual style, but the general principle stands. And then that goes to one side. And when you know what you're writing about, then it's gathering the information. And that's the bit I think that's really fun. So if I know I'm after people skills and I'm specifically looking at influencing skills, for example, then I start gathering stories. I'll think, okay, who could I interview that I know is a really great influencer? Or where can I find a really great article on influencing people? Or what are the seminal books on that particular subject? And then I start diving deep into that particular topic. And I'll use Evernote, or I might print things, and I have little folders for each chapter. So I just start stuffing the folders with all the content that I think is relevant and pertinent, that will give the reader a rich experience. So I build it up I don't build it from detail and build it out, which is what a lot of first-time authors do and why they get thought spaghetti. I build it from the skeleton first and then put the flesh on top of it, put the muscles on top of it layer by layer, and then putting the skin on it and putting the wrapper on it is the final edit, when you start putting all those stories and anecdotes and research together. And then there's a polish at the end where you think, okay, now I've got all the pieces. Does it flow? Does it link from one thing to the next? Does it elegantly move through? Is it a combination of stories and science and anecdotes? Does it keep the reader engaged? All those questions are sort of end of the process questions. The key thing is just getting the key chunks of information. Does that make sense of the science of it?
It absolutely does. And I have to say that thought spaghetti is quite possibly the best way to describe what every author might go through.
Yeah, without a process, it's very easy. And of course, once you start writing, here's the thing. Once you start writing and you get your thoughts muddled up, it's very, very difficult to untangle them. Mm-hmm. So I think the biggest tip I can give to anybody who's not an experienced writer who wants to either produce more work or improve the quality of the work, or just pick up some early stage tips, is to write in a modular fashion. And that means one paragraph equals one idea. And that's what a lot of people that get to thought spaghetti land, they don't do that. They talk about 3 ideas in a paragraph. And then when they realize that the book gets up beyond 10,000 words and you start reading it and you think, oh, hang on, that thought doesn't connect well with that thought. So I need to separate it. But then you look at the paragraph afterwards and you think, well, I can't separate it because now I've created the next paragraph comes from the previous paragraph. So if I take that apart, I can't then use the next paragraph. So I've got to rewrite that or remove it. And then that happens with the next paragraph and the next paragraph and the next paragraph. So once you cook the spaghetti and once it gets tangled up, and that's exactly what happens, you can't uncook it again. So it's much easier as a writer. You'll get much better quality work if you keep the spaghetti uncooked, because it's easy to stack when it's uncooked spaghetti, isn't it? If you drop it on the floor and pick it all back up, you wouldn't necessarily eat it, but you can pick it up all from the floor and you can stack it again. So if you write one paragraph, one idea, you can always restack your ideas and you can reorder them. The links between the ideas come later, because that gives you flexibility.
That's very, very true. And I think a lot of fiction writers can also apply that. To some degree, they have a little bit more freedom, but they still have to be organized. And they often don't realize this until they get into the editing process. Yeah. And the editor is going, none of this comes together. Your flow is wrong. This doesn't go here. So thought spaghetti, I think, can also apply to that process.
The structure of having a good storyboard is a similar framework that you'd use as a non-fiction author for creating a business book, for example. So even a story needs a beginning, middle, and end. You need to decide who the players are and how they move through time, and the same principles in terms of the information science still applies, is that the reader has to know at any one page who they're reading about. And what's interesting, I learned from designing intranets, is that it has a lot more in common with books than people first think about. So if you think about it, when you go onto a website these days, you don't land on the homepage necessarily. You land on the page that the search has brought up, or that somebody's sent you to. So you might, if you went to my website, you might have gone to my website because you want me to speak at your conference. And in that case, you've probably landed on sophiebennett.com/keynote. You're not necessarily going to land on my homepage that says, "Hi, thanks for visiting. Sophie does this, this, and this." You're going to go straight to that page. And if you think about what a book does, you very rarely, people read a book in one sitting. So although you might know what you read previously, you wouldn't have read it necessarily the same day or even the same week. You might have picked it up the week before. I've got books scattered all over the house that I'm halfway through, and that's typical of people's reading styles and where we have busy lives. So people have the same orientation challenge every time they reopen a book. You think if you open a book on a new chapter, what's the first thing that you do before you start reading again if you haven't read it for a couple of days?
You go back and check the end of the previous
chapter.
You go
back and check the end of the previous chapter, absolutely. And it's a little bit the same on a website. If you're on a website or a big intranet, you look at the menu bar to see where you are, to see how you got there and how to get back out again. Mm-hmm. So readers do the same thing. So it's just like having a storyboard for a plot. People will look back and remember the last scene. In just the same way that when you watch a TV show, they use the same information science. So if you go and watch a rerun of a Grey's Anatomy or a House or any of those TV serials with ongoing stories, they'll always show you the last, the key scenes from the last parts of the plot from the last one that you watched. And it's the same principle. They're helping you orientate yourself with where you are with the characters, where you are with the story, and where you are in time and space. So whether it's an intranet site, whether you're writing a script for a TV show, whether you're writing a non-fiction book, or whether you're writing fiction, the reader's behavior will always be the same. They'll always say, okay, where were we? What happened last? What do I remember from the last chapter? What was the summary? Where are we going with this? And if you satisfy those criteria, and you can use subheaders for that, you can use graphics for that, you can do language recaps for that. There's lots of techniques, and there's as many techniques as there are books. I use tables, I use bulleted lists, I use little recaps, I use all sorts of different methods depending on the book. But if you understand the science behind it, you can find your own unique way to do that. That'll be unique to you and help your reader orientate in times and space. And it will help your editors as well, by the way, because they'll be, oh heavens, I actually know where I am in this book.
It's fascinating, and something that I caught a few times while you were speaking was talking about motivation, whether that's the motivation of your storyline or the motivation of your writing. And this ties really closely into your work on your website, where your tagline is people, purpose, motivation, and strategy. So I feel like we know the strategy part a little bit, even as it applies to writing, possibly not necessarily to your work directly. But what would you say, as far as authors are concerned, what's the difference between purpose, motivation, and strategy when it comes to how they approach their work?
Okay, well, let's start with purpose. That's a really good question, by the way. Not one I've ever been asked before. So.
Oh, yay.
Okay. So when it comes to purpose in writing, I think there's two core ones. One is writing for yourself, where you're using the writing process to untie your thought spaghetti. And that in itself is a very valid reason to write. So there's no onus on anybody else to read it necessarily. Maybe special interest groups would be interested in what you've got to say. But so I have two purposes for my writing, and I think most writers do. stuff you write for yourself to organize your thoughts and decide if you're interested in something or not, if something's going to attract your intellectual curiosity. So it's a sort of a selfish side of the writing. And then there's the other purpose, the other motivation for writing is that you've got something you want to share. And then the writing becomes very reader focused as opposed to very writer focused. So there's a lot of non-fiction books out there that are very focused on the writer. And I think most people's first books tend to be very writer focused. They're almost quite cathartic and say, oh, you don't realize how much you know about a topic until you start writing about it. As people mature as writers, I start to see a development where people switch and start saying, okay, this is what I know, but is it relevant? Is it helpful? Does it add something to the sum of human knowledge? Or is this going to add, if I tell my reader this now, is it going to help them or is it going to confuse them? And any good writing, any good speaking, any communication really follows what I think it's at its best following Peter Drucker's advice, the late management consultant. And he says that strategy is largely a skill of omission. I love that, because it's actually what you leave out that has the power. And there's a great quote by Ernest Hemingway, I think it was, who said, I was going to write you a short letter, but I didn't have time. Because it's much, much harder to write a short story than it is to write a long one, because you have to crystallize your thoughts. It's much harder to write a 1 Minute Manager in 20,000 words than it is to write Tony Robbins' Power Within of 110,000 words, because you can ramble if you've got 100,000 words to play with. If you've only got 20, you have to crystallize your thinking, and that takes much more effort, I think, than most people expect. It gives you real brain ache sometimes. But it's an intellectual challenge.
Very true.
Yeah, it's the intellectual challenge that motivates me. And initially, it was writing for myself. My first book was very cathartic. And I think it was only because I had a trained writing skill that it was so successful. That certainly I didn't really understand my audience at that point. But I made the book very conversational, and I tried to use reader-directed language. So I talked about things that you might have experienced and things that you could relate to. Use the you word a lot, or we've all experienced X, Y, or Z. So that made it quite conversational. But the content was really about me exposing and sorting through my experiences around the psychology of money, because that was my first book, was around the psychology of money. And it did really well. But when I look back at it now, I'm still very proud of some of the prose and the text, and it's a very quotable book. But I look and think, was it actually that helpful to people? I still get letters about it, so it clearly has helped people. But this next piece of work and the latter books I've written for other people are much more about what the reader gets out of it. So I think that's why the later ones have done better, is just experience as a writer. And if you're using your writing as a platform for something else, the reader experience is really what it becomes all about. And I earn my living from keynote speaking primarily. So I was out at, a major national organisation's head office running their finance director leader program last night in London. And then, that's paid keynoting. I'd have to sell 1,000 books to earn as much as I earn from that, 55 minutes. But the books, however, are a platform to get me into those places. So they have to be great quality. Because if it's not a great quality book, people have booked the speech and then they cancel it when they see the price. So a little bit, it does depend what the book is, what the purpose of the book is for each individual. That's why it's so much fun. It's unique for everybody.
Why do you think some authors can be very clear on their purpose or very clear on their motivation, but still struggle with the concept of creating a strategy to take their writing to the next level?
In my experience, because I work with other authors as well, and I'm just about to launch a book club actually to connect authors and readers together. So I'm speaking to a lot of authors about these very topics at the moment. I think partly it's because people who write for a hobby don't necessarily have a clear strategy because there isn't that commercial impetus behind it. And actually commercial impetus, people often think about, the commercial side of it as potentially selling out, or wouldn't it be nice if we didn't need the money? But actually the commercial element of it gives it real clarity, because you have to ask questions about what your audience really wants. When you write as a hobby, it sort of doesn't matter what the audience really wants, because it's about you. It's about having a hobby, and that's great. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But I think where people do have a missing strategy is where there isn't the imperative to be reader focused. And so they sort of wander around not really sure what they're trying to achieve. They just know they like writing. They know that they like the creative process, but aren't quite sure where they want to go with it. And any lack of clarity in anything, whether it's writing, if you write a book without a clear outcome in mind, the book is inevitably going to wander because it doesn't know where it's going to go. And it's the same business. If you don't know what you're trying to achieve for your customers and commercially, you don't know how to get there. You're going to be constantly flip-flopping, changing direction, trying things for a bit, giving up, trying something else. And you can feel when that's happening in a book as well. But everybody needs to learn, we don't, I certainly have written some things that now I wouldn't write the same way again. The hardest thing is to stop, because every time you read a draft, you think it could be better, it could be better, it could be better. And at some point you have to stop, which is really difficult, because you always want to improve it. So yeah, having real clarity about what the outcome is, whether that be commercial or otherwise, what are you trying to achieve for your reader? That's where I think most people struggle. Once they get that clear, then it's a breeze after that.
I could sit and pick your brain for hours. I've barely even asked any of the questions that I thought I would today, which is fantastic because this has just been a wonderful chat. But we're down to the end of our time slot. So I'm just going to ask you two more questions. One, what's your favorite book? And two, what advice would you give to authors listening today if they're struggling with why they write?
Okay, favorite book. Wow, that's one. I wasn't prepared for that one. Let me turn and look over my shoulder for a moment at some of my favorites. That's an almost impossible question, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to reply with my favorite business authors, because that's my genre.
Perfect.
And I would recommend all of their books, and that is Chip and Dan Heath, who are brothers or twin brothers. One of them is a behavioral economist from Duke, I think. The other one is a professor at Stanford, maybe. But anyway, they're both Ivy League professors, and they write brilliantly on the subject of change and human behavior with a really light touch. And I believe Dan does most of the writing, and Chip contributes the framework, the key ideas. And they work really well as a team. So Chip and Dan Heath are my favourites. My current favourite of theirs is a book called The Power of Moments. And there's a lovely story there with somebody I interviewed for the book who creates moments of impact on a global scale, a founder of a charity called Buy One, Give One, or B1G1. And he was telling me about the power of moments they made. And I got Chip to sign a copy of his new book and send it to Paul in Singapore. And I got the most amazing tearful message to say that it was the most impactful moment he'd had in a long time. So that was a lovely little story. So next question. Seeing we're short on time.
Yeah. What was the advice that you would give to authors who are maybe struggling with their why they write?
Okay, I'd say to try and really put some time into thinking about what the outcome is. Is the book, or is your writing something you're doing for yourself? And if it's purely for you, work out what you're trying to get out of it. Is it clarity of thought? Is it to confirm knowledge? Is it to research? Is it for intellectual curiosity? Because once you know where you're trying to go with it, then the strategy becomes easy. Once you've got the destination, the strategy becomes easy. If you're if you know why you want to write and you're just not sure how to do it, I'd say go back to the beginning of this podcast, listen to that structural concept about how people move around information, map the big idea, chunk it down, fill in the gaps, and away you go.
I think that's absolutely brilliant advice. And I want to thank you so much for the amazing information that you were able to squeeze into only 30 minutes. I'm going to have to listen to it again myself over and over and over again. And go ahead and just to close us out here, all of the information for where our audience can find you will be located in the podcast description. But if you could go ahead and just tell them where they can find you in case they are just listening and can't see it right now, where can they find you on the internet?
Great. So I'm easy to find. I'm sophiebennett.com. That's Bennett, BENNETT.com. And all my social channels are labeled the same, Sophie Bennett UK. So I'm Twitter at Sophie Bennett UK, Facebook at Sophie Bennett UK. So yeah, I'm pretty easy to find. And LinkedIn, I'm Sophie Bennett UK as well. So I'd always be delighted to connect with readers and join podcasts and join groups and answer questions. I always try and give as much as I can back to the writing community that's looked after me so well.
Well, we are so thankful that you are willing to give back by being on our show today.
Oh, it's been a delight.
We would be honored to have you at any time. So hopefully we will be able to catch you again on a future episode. But I want to thank you again for your time. And I hope that you have an excellent, it's evening for both of us now. So
yeah, my pleasure. And I'll let you know when the book's out. So we're looking at middle of July at the moment. And I'd love to come on and share some of the things about purpose and motivation that I discovered from some amazing interviews that I got to do too, that I think could really help your audience. So thanks very much for having me. It's been a blast.
That's amazing. And I'll definitely reach out about getting Sophie Bennett Part 2.
Great. Thank you very much for having me.
We want to thank you for joining us today for the Happy Writing Podcast. And as always, don't forget to head over to happywriting.co and take advantage of that $5 deal just for listening to our podcast. You can join the Author Lounge for $5 for your first 3 months using the code Happy Podcast. If you want to sponsor a future episode, you can also find that information under happywriting.co/podcast. We look forward to seeing you next Tuesday at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for our next author interview.